When I was a couple weeks short of my 70th birthday, I started thinking about my mother's mother, who lived to be 100, and her mother, who lived to be 102, and my father, who lived to be 90. I began to think that maybe our generation could be the first to routinely live to be 100. When I talked about this at family dinner one night, my granddaughter, who was 5, said,
"What are you going to do for the next 30 years, Grandpa?"
Hello, I'm Dr. Janet Price.
And I'm Gregg Kaloust. And we are Oldish. And this is our podcast, Oldish.
If you're oldish or know someone who is, please join us for conversations amongst ourselves
And our special guests.
about what it means to be oldish in the 21st century.
If you ever wonder whether you're getting old, you're Oldish. What are you going to do for the next 30 minutes? Hi, I'm Gregg, and I'm Oldish.
Hi, I'm Janet, and I'm oldish. And welcome to this episode of this podcast, Oldish, Conversations on Aging in the 21st Century. Hey, Gregg, look, here we are. We've made it a year into our podcast.
I think that's very exciting and only somewhat surprising. We both have a tendency to stick to it once we get started on something, but it took us a while to get underway. But once we're underway, I don't think either one of us wants to stop.
Yeah.
We've been talking about doing this conversation about our 1-year anniversary and looking back on what happened this year and what led us to here and what our thoughts about what the next year might look like. We have come around almost full cycle. The trailer we published in April last year, but the first full episode was published on May 11th. So this episode will be published just prior to May 11th. So it's a good year-end wrap-up, so to speak. So, and we've covered a lot of territory. We've covered a lot of ground. We've been listened to in a lot of places. Earlier, while we were just chatting, you wondered about how many countries we had been listened to in. And that number is 31 and over 450 cities. We get something I didn't know when we went into this is that the statistics that we can get from our service provider, Buzzsprout, that hosts the podcast, includes location data. Not precise enough location data so that I can say, oh yeah, John listened. But I can see that somebody who lives near where John lives listened. I don't know if it was John or not. The statistics on how many people have listened are kind of tricky because there's no way to know whether somebody actually listens. They click on a button and they start to listen and then they stop, or they listen all the way through. The podcast distributors like Apple Podcasts and Spotify and those don't have a good way to determine whether somebody actually listens to the whole thing. And a very common way to listen to a podcast is podcast is a sound file that you listen to on a device. And so you can listen to it while it's downloading, or you can listen to it after it's all downloaded. So the statistics are kept as downloads, which is not necessarily the same thing as somebody listened all the way through. But I can say that we've had over 1,700 downloads, approaching 1,800. We have a pretty good chance, I think, of making it to close to 2,000 downloads in our first season. So it looks to me like we're averaging 100 downloads per episode. And I'm going to interpret a download as a listen. So our podcasts are listened to an average of 100 per episode so far. And that has grown, obviously, quite a bit since we started. You know, that's in less than a year. We went from no downloads to approaching 1,800. So that's pretty good, I think. The list of cities is remarkable, just from all over the place. And there's not a clear way to find out how people heard about the podcast, but we've done some work on getting the word out. And I suspect we'll talk about that a little bit during our conversation today. One thing I want to say early on for people who are still listening is a couple of months ago, our website provider, a company called Podpage, which is where www.oldish.me lives, the website, added in the ability for people to comment on the podcasts. And so far, nobody has, but I think that's possibly because people don't go to the website. They go to Apple Podcasts or Spotify or whatever and don't follow it. But if you should have an urge to comment on one or more of the podcasts, there is a way to comment on our website at www.oldish.me.
And I'd also add to that, if you have any suggestions for future topics and or speakers, guests that could come in and have a conversation with us.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that'd be great. One of the challenges that I should have been able to anticipate but didn't was figuring out how to get a hold of somebody that we want to talk to, how to fill up the guest list, so to speak. We've taken different approaches and we've had different results. Some of the people that we've spoken to are people that are friends of Janet's or friends of mine, or people, in at least one case, people that we both already knew. Some people have just appeared. Some people have contacted us. There is a way on our website for people to contact us. Let's talk about things we've learned over the 12 months of doing this, things that we have learned together and things that we've learned individually and things that we've learned from our guests. And I think in a few instances, we've learned some things with our guests. I think we've uncovered some things in the course of conversations that people didn't expect that they were going to talk about or think about. So in the 12 months that we've been doing this, what leaps out at you as things that you've learned?
One of the most exciting parts of this for me, especially as I've just this past few days taken a look at what the episodes have been, who we've talked to, what we've talked about, is the richness of Oldish community. It does take me back to, I do want to, if it's okay, jump to what you and I were thinking that brought us to the place of creating this podcast. We'd been talking for maybe a few years, you and I, about oldishness and where does that fit into the developmental process of being human and specifically aging, and thinking about past generations, our parents and relatives, how we wanted to do this differently. And so it's been very rewarding for me to listen to a number of people, our guests, talk about what it means to them to be oldish. And it's felt rewarding to hear what I think you and I were hoping for and wondering about once we get past our youth and whatever that looks like, working, having a family, being hopefully feeling success in our endeavors, that we can not have to stop, so that our wisdom and continued journey happens and happens in a rich way. What about you?
I feel like I've learned a lot in the last 12 months, both through the podcast itself. I sort of knew what podcasts were before we started this. That's why we were talking about podcasts. I'd listened to a few podcasts. I'd never listened to one that was quite like this. More of the podcasts that I listened to were either somebody telling a story. Some of them were like radio plays. Passenger List comes to mind of a podcast that I listened to before we started doing this. That was a radio play about. I'm not even 100% sure. Season 2 veered off a little bit, but it was telling a story through a radio play. And podcasting is a lot like old time radio. It's a sound based thing rather than a video, YouTube or Instagram or TikTok or those things that are video based. It's audio based. So it has a lot in common with radio. We kind of grew up with radio. It was a big thing. Everybody that I knew when I was a kid had a transistor radio in their pocket. And they listened to music and they listened to people talk. But I didn't really clearly know what I thought a podcast was when we started, which was probably a good thing, or we might not have started it. There's a lot of technology involved in it. And I'm glad to say that in the course of a year, I'm not going to say that we've mastered the technology, but we've sure learned a heck of a lot about the technology. Even sitting here looking at you through the Zoom-like website that we're using, I don't think that was even really there 4 years ago. There was video conferencing. Certainly the blossoming of Zoom through the pandemic made a big difference in the technology. In addition to the things like you and I are both now, we're wearing headsets and we have microphones, and we didn't when we started doing it. We just talked into our computers and discovered fairly early on that sound quality makes a difference. Listening for any length of time to people who sound like they're at opposite ends of a submarine doesn't necessarily provide for a comfortable listening experience. So we've learned a lot about the technology. The editing technology that's behind the scenes for me has been a huge learning curve. I never knew how to do any of that stuff. I've known how to talk my whole life, and I know a fair amount about computer technology, but I had no idea how to edit a podcast. Literally no idea. And I do all of the podcast editing. And so I went from not ever having seen any of the available tools to do that with just a little over 12 months ago, just before we started. I figured it'd be a good idea if somebody learned how to do that. So over the last 15 months, I've gone from not having ever seen any of those tools to having opinions about which ones are good and which ones are better. And I've learned a lot about oldishness. Everybody that we've talked to has been more than happy to reveal different aspects of their own oldishness. And we've talked theoretically about oldishness. What is oldishness? What does the word mean? What does the concept mean in our modern culture? But the approach that we've taken of not having people on to tell us what oldishness is, but to tell us how they feel, I think has revealed a lot to us. And I think in some cases, our guests have learned some things about themselves while talking with us. I've seen that in more than one case. So yeah, a lot of learning in 12 months.
Yes. And one of the things I've been thinking about recently is my own journey in oldishness while doing this podcast about Oldish. That's been interesting to me because I'm a year older and I'm becoming aware of more of the different emotions and struggles and celebrations that come with being oldish. And so it almost feels like a friend or a community for me that we're doing this together and we're figuring this out together. We talked with each of our guests just about what they are doing and what do they think about at this moment in their lives. What are they thinking about? What it means to be oldish. There was conversations about post-retirement, re-careering, some different interesting words that were used by our guests about what does it mean to be at this place in our lives. So that's one of my learnings.
And that's one of the things that oldishness is about, is continued learnings. So it's good that we're talking about it, but we're also modeling it to a certain extent. I think that having the podcast has also contributed to my ongoing oldishness as opposed to getting old. It's given me something to focus on, a bit of a purpose. And it certainly has added to my social life quite a bit because people talk to me about it.
Something you said a little bit ago was interesting for me about people coming on in this time of being oldish. And you said made me think of that we haven't defined oldish, I don't think, in a kind of concrete definition type way. And I feel like that reflects the whole style that we have on our podcast about conversations. That conversations aren't necessarily about facts and about imparting information, but sitting together and talking about our experiences. So when you said that, I thought to myself that listeners might be thinking, well, what is Oldish? You haven't even said that yet after a whole year. And I think as you listen to the different episodes, you realize that, at least from my perspective, that there isn't a specific definition, such as what is the age group for Oldish? When does it start? When does it end? How do you know? So I like that.
Yeah, I like that too. It's kind of open-ended without too many constraints. Kind of like being alive.
Yes.
And the conversations about it seems to me like conversations around the campfire or around a dinner table or over drink somewhere, or people might get together to talk. Something that I've been thinking about ever since I first got connected to the internet back in the 1980s was non-local community. Prior to the internet, I think, for the most part, not entirely, because people traveled and so on, but the search for community has been a big part of my life. One of our guests recently made reference to the traditional family not existing prior to the late 19th century, what we think of as the traditional family. Well, it's also the case that prior to that, community was really important to people. It's always been important to people. You don't think of individual hunter-gatherers, but you think of hunter-gatherer tribes and communities, really, of people who are engaged in the same interests. When I was growing up, the communities in America had been really broken pretty seriously, that people had up and moved, and it was partially the story of America, as people moved from wherever they started out came to North America, and then a whole bunch of them moved west and south, and it just kept on moving, often in search of community, sometimes escaped from the community that they were in. But in the 20th century, it seems to me that with the nuclear family and suburbs and people working for giant corporations who could transfer you at their whim or put you out of work at their whim, and the migrations from a rural society to an urban society that took place really during the late 19th and throughout the 20th centuries, those really broke communities to a great extent. So when I was growing up, the community that I lived in was a town where my parents had moved. It wasn't where they were from. And I don't think I knew anybody that was from that town. And I longed for community my whole life. And then when the internet started back in the 1980s, I discovered that community can be non-local, that there can be people that have the same interests or similar interests to yours who can converse with you at length about these similar interests, who you may never see in person. They're thousands of miles away. When I first got on the internet, I had a conversation about something with somebody in New Zealand through text messages over the internet in the late 1980s. So to discover that non-local community in a very rich way in our world of podcasting has been pretty good. As I said, we've had listeners from many parts of the world and lots of different towns. And I'm guessing that many of those people are part of the Oldish community and not part of a geographical community or an ethnic community or a racial community or whatever, but they're part of the Oldish community. I think one of the things that we've brought to the community is an awareness of that. I'd never heard anybody say Oldish before we did.
Thinking about community, and when you think about, there's usually a theme that draws people together into a community. So our theme being Oldish, and then within a community that's drawn together by a theme, there's a uniqueness within that community. So I'm thinking about the people we've talked to and how being Oldish will include all sorts of different experiences, professions, life changes at the time of retirement, if retirement is what happens for someone. So when you think about the range of our unique guests under the umbrella of Oldish, we talked to someone about adoption and reunion. We talked to someone about recareering, what he did with his new space in his life as an oldish person. We talked about someone climbing to base camp in Mount Everest for awareness and raising money for Duchenne muscular dystrophy research, and talked to someone about sexual awakening in oldishness. Um, you know, pickleball. What is it like to discover pickleball as an oldish person and fall in love so much with it that you write a book about it? Our list goes on as far as, and we'll go on into our new next year of all the different ways people experience their oldishness within their life experience and their life journey, their career journey, their family. We talked to someone about long distance grandparenting and what that has been like. So it's an interesting community.
There seems like there are as many different styles of oldishness as there are oldish people, which is to be expected.
Mm-hmm.
They seem to have one thing in common, which is an attitude that life is for living and let's do it. It's not to say that everybody's cheerfully marching forward into the future all the time. I know that's not the case, but this attitude of not done yet is, I think, characteristic of people who are oldish. And as our recent guest pointed out, there's a lot more of those people than we were led to believe. He asked people in other countries about the United States, about aging in the United States, and discovered that they were aghast that everybody in the United States, after a certain age, is in a nursing home and just abandoned by their families and community, and they live in nursing homes. And he pointed out that only 5% of older Americans, and that's a lot of people when you think about the boomers, that's a lot of people, that only 5% of that lot of people, which still, that still adds up to a lot of people too. It's still millions of people, but it's only 5% of people living in nursing homes, and everybody else is not, which means that they are continuing to live their lives and get up and move around and do their stuff to the extent that they're able to do it. That was a little bit surprising to me. I actually figured that the oldish community was smaller than what it is, but it really is quite large.
I agree that what I've heard from our guests is overwhelmingly hopeful at this time, when I think our society, at least historically, has not been the message. It's been kind of like, pull out a chair, start knitting for the past, and be thankful for what you've had, which is good. And, we're talking about, okay, right now, while we're healthy, and anyone who is able to be healthy and able to experience life, what is that? One person said that they felt like their world was getting bigger after retirement. They were finding that there was time now for giving back. One quote was, being oldish pushes ourselves to be the best we can be until the very end. I love that.
Yeah.
Almost like our theme is, what does that mean? Push yourselves, or be yourselves and the best you can be till the very end.
Yes, I have to throw in something about knitting, which is, I think, actually older people who knit are actually oldish, because you have to make new things all the time. I don't want to leave the impression that we think that people who knit are
Good.
old. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
Or that it's not a healthy way to be old. I think knitting is great. And so good. I'm glad you pointed that out.
So what are we looking forward to in the next year, do you think?
Well, I'm looking forward to, as I was just sitting here talking right now, I'm thinking, what will it be like a year from now, if we're fortunate enough to get to that point, to look back at this next year, and what will be different, the same. I'm looking forward to exploring more aspects of life as an oldish person. I'm looking forward to having continued uniqueness and diversity in our guests. I mean, there's so much to talk about. There's so many ways this impacts us. I'm excited that we started our regularly scheduled book club. We've had one episode so far, so I'm looking forward to that in this new next year of what that's like and what books we end up talking about. And I'm wondering if we might find other one or two more regularly scheduled themes. We started with one, I think the first theme we started with was Pickleball Nomads. So it'll be interesting to see if there's some episodes / experiences shared from you about Pickleball Nomad. So I guess I'm looking forward to seeing what evolves that's new, what continues that is familiar, and also possibly continuing to look at some of the themes that we've looked at this year, like our guest that talked about her book, Her Sexual Awakening at 70. I think there's a lot more to talk about sex and romantic relationships in our oldest years. So I think most of the topics that we've talked about, we can dig in and talk more about them.
We're not rookies anymore. We're not masters of it, but we kind of already know how to do this, and we have our equipment in place. You mentioned the book club, and the book that we're currently reading, the three of us, to talk about in our next book club meeting is a book actually about oldishness, maybe one of the first books that I can think of about oldishness, John Steinbeck's Travels with Charlie, where in his early 60s, he picked up with his dog and took off in a camper and drove around the country looking for America. So we're going to talk about that book, but I've been thinking about that book, and I started reading it again when I was actually on the road last fall. And I don't know that I'm actually going to do this, but my list of things to do in the coming year is to trace his journey. That this is, I'm going off, and the Pickleball Nomad is living in my van for a period of time while I'm driving around and stopping off to play pickleball from time to time. I have a map of where he went, and he traveled 10,000 miles in 11 weeks and had lots of adventures. And that was in 1962. 1960. The book came out in 62, but that was in 1960 that he did it. When I was 10, I read the book when I was 12, and I'm going to go see how it's changed. One of the things that we didn't do much of, but we certainly set the stage for, is doing conversations not in the studio, so to speak, but out on the road somewhere. So we had our conversation about reconnecting with adoptive families, and I was sitting in the van on the coast somewhere down east. I don't even remember exactly where I was now, but I was somewhere down east sitting in the van looking at the ocean while we were talking. And I don't see any reason to not talk with people when I'm out on the road or where you're traveling or whatever. So I think that kind of thing is in our future. I hope that one of the things that happens in our future is that people get in touch with us and say, oh, you should talk to so-and-so. That's happened a couple of times, and every time it's happened, it's turned out really well. So I hope that we get more of that. I hope that one of the things that happens in our second year is people in the community engaging more with us. That's why we went to the trouble of getting a website where people can comment and possibly have conversations with each other. One of the things that I think we need to learn is how to let more people know about our podcast, so that next year when we talk and visit, we talk about 1,000 downloads per episode as opposed to 100. I've had people come up to me in different places around the country and say, oh, you're that podcast guy. You've got that Oldish podcast. And one thing I hope that happens next year is we can interview people who have listened to our podcast and then done things. We already have one person who's told me that she was inspired by our podcast to go do things. And I hope that within the next year, we'll be able to interview her and people like her who have felt their lives shift a little bit because of their entry into this community.
And I hope that our goal for the coming year is something that was true in this year, and it's something I want to make sure we hold in our conversations is we've asked every time we've had an episode, what are you excited about being oldish and what scares you about being oldish? And I want to make sure that we have room in our conversations for what scares you, because I think that's a part of probably every developmental stage, but it's definitely true being oldish. And so as much as we've had such wonderful conversations with people who are redefining what this time in their life is in such exciting ways and positive ways, they have shared. We asked every person, what is your fear? So I want to make sure that we have room for that, that people feel that those conversations happen and reflect what people who are oldish are feeling.
I want to make sure to say that one of the big parts of this experience over the last year has been our deepening friendship. This has been really important to me from that aspect. It's something that I certainly never expected, that I would get to know somebody better by sitting in remote conversations with them, with other people talking about stuff. It's been a great pleasure for me to spend the time that we spent in the last year working on the podcast, talking on the podcast, talking about the podcast, planning, doing all that stuff. And I think I should say that the single thing that makes our podcast stand out is your questions. You always have the best questions.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks. And I agree with you. I mean, I want to say ditto to everything you just said. It has been quite a journey together. And I was just thinking about that we are living our own lives at the same time. In this past year, you had someone close to you, a relative, die. I had someone close to me in my family die. We've had other experiences going along. So it is a pleasure to go through this journey with you. And I think we are a nice balance for each other, how we talk, how we listen, what we think of to bring up. So as we wind down for this episode, I want to say thank you to everyone who's been listening. Thank you for sharing this with others. Thank you for being curious about oldishness and being part of this community. And we look forward to continuing this journey with you all into this next year of our podcast.
I couldn't have said that better myself. Okay. Bye, all.
Bye.
That's it for now. Thanks for listening. Thanks to Janet for bringing her full self to these conversations. We're very grateful to all our guests and you, our listeners, for joining us to make this first year a great success. We wouldn't have done it without you. Our next episode will be our second Oldish Book Club with our friend Leslie. We'll be talking about Travels with Charlie, Nobel Prize-winning author John Steinbeck's trip around America in a camper with his dog Charlie in 1960. A true epic of oldishness. Stay tuned. You can leave comments on this or other episodes at www.oldish.me. If you like what you heard today, please tell a friend and rate and review our podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. It will always be true that the most fun I ever had playing pickleball was just us hitting the ball back and forth and laughing on the little court next to the library with the river flowing by and the eagles wheeling overhead.